Some states have laws that you cannot prevent teachers from putting up historical documents. I think it's good that they have laws. I don't know why they have to have them, but that's kind of the way censorship would be in our world. But anything that's a previous American founder or a previous American leader, we ought to be able to put it up. I did go to the parent-teacher conference because the daughter wasn't going and grandparents could go. So when I went to Crockett Middle School this year, I noticed that nearly all the rooms had a cross in them. I mean, that's better than it could be. I did not remember, because I wasn't alert to it, how many political quotations there would be. But it seems like in Texas it would be safe to put up any political quotations of the past that we wanted to. We normally teach the Bible verse by verse and do not do American history, but I feel like 4th of July can be an exception. So we've been going through 1 Corinthians, and we've been talking about here's wisdom from God and here's foolishness from the world. But we will delay 1 Corinthians, and we will look a little bit about American history. And among things, where did all these groups come from? You drive around town, and there's this kind of church and that kind of church, and every few blocks is a different kind of church, and that's kind of distinctly American. They're different groups all over the place. Well, that's kind of how it was settled. The United States does not have a state church that taxes can go to it, does not have a state church that's the official church, or even like European times where you're supposed to go to that church and be a member of that church. Most of the European countries did have state churches. That was the official church. That got money from the government. That was the approved church. Some degrees of persecution if you didn't go there, up and down, depending on over the decades. But a lot of Americans came here to get away from a state church. We have verses for each of the colonies here. We won't have time to read them all, but maybe you can look at me at the first one, Jeremiah 6. And Jeremiah 6 does give the philosophy of remembering the past, looking into the past, which is what we're going to try to do. Jeremiah 6 and verse 16. Thus says the Lord, stand by the ways and see and ask for the ancient past, where the good way is, and walk in it, and you shall find rest for our souls. But they said, we will not. Of course, originally he's talking to Judah. This is just before Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. Look for the past ways. And it didn't specifically say Americans should do this, but that's good for us to look at our past, to look at the way things were, to ask which road did they go down, because basically with a lot of them at the founding of the country, if we go down the same way, we'll be doing well. John Winthrop came to the United States in 1630, first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, he made a speech on the way over. For we must consider that we shall be like a city on the hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. And of course, city on the hill is a reference to the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus had said, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. And then later on, city on the hill. He was, John Winthrop, coming over with 4 ships, 700 people. The next year was another 700. The next year was another 800. The next year was another 3,000. And these groups just kept coming over and over. Quoting from him again, there is now set before us life and good, death and evil, in that we are to love the Lord your God and walk in his ways. And they pray that the Lord their God will bless them in the land where they go to possess it. So the Pilgrims were a little bit earlier, but we'll talk a little bit more about the Puritans. They came over a great numbers. And following Jeremiah's lesson of looking at the past, the Puritans came over in great numbers. They were the first to start to settle, and it will give a number of the churches they started to build shortly. We will read the verses for you, so we won't have to look them up, but let's look at the different colonies. Thought we would begin with the first colony, Jamestown. 1607 is very, very early. Now, they ended up being the Episcopalians. Their church is called the Anglican Church or Church of England, but of course, after the American Revolution, you can't put a sign out front that says it's the Church of England, because the visitors won't come. So in America, it became known as the Episcopalian Church. Definitely, they were the Episcopalian Church in Jamestown, named after King James. Virginia, named after saying Queen Elizabeth was a virgin all her life. So the town and the colony were named after the king, and we'll have to say they were, in their charter, Episcopalian. The charter did say in Jamestown that they built the place for the propagation of the Christian religion. So, wasn't perfect, because they also wanted to make a lot of money, a little bit of money in Jamestown. Not all religion, but there was the Church of England there. And we picked a verse for them, Church of England, to honor the king. One time I read a real weird book. It was a book on the American Revolution, but it was written by a Canadian. That's quite something, because the Canadian would have said, like Romans 13, honor the king, and what were the Americans doing? How's that for a thought? Read a Canadian history book on America sometime. Anyway, in Jamestown, they were Episcopalians. It was the Church of England. The thesis is honor the king. Now we move on to the independent Pilgrims. And thinking of the Pilgrims, I thought of a Thanksgiving verse. That sort of makes sense when we think of them. So that's Psalm 107, verse 1. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His loving kindness is everlasting. So the Pilgrims were known for their Thanksgiving. They were supposed to go to Virginia, but the boats didn't make it there. And they ended up further north. William Bradford, it was their main author, and he talked about leaving, and they left in two boats. The Mayflower was one of them. The second one was the Speedwell, and it leaked, and it cracked, and they had to go back and put everybody on the Mayflower, 102. But here's some like Christian quotes. So they committed themselves to the will of God and resolved to proceed. Getting there, of course, it was winter. One letter about Thanksgiving, talking about it, the next Thanksgiving was in December. So they got there in November 1620, and then all the next year before the first Thanksgiving. And here are some more of their quotes. What could sustain them now but the Spirit of God and His grace? Pilgrims were independent. They kind of wanted to honor the king, but they weren't going to totally be part of the Church of England. They were going to be independent. Now, in thinking of us, we are mostly like Baptists theologically. Church government, we're mostly independent. Westcliff Bible Church is independent. There are disadvantages of it, but there are advantages of it because we don't have a denomination that owns the building, which all denominations will tell their members, we own your building. So there are value in being independent. Jamestown was what we call Episcopalian. The Pilgrims were totally independent. Now we talk a little bit more about the Puritans. They came to New England. They came in greater numbers. The Pilgrims were fewer. The Puritans were more and more of them. The verse I picked was one that their leaders quoted. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. And then they talked about they were the light. The Puritans come over in greater numbers. I gave the list earlier, but more and more and more of them. Puritans were what they called a low church. High church, Episcopalian, would be wearing of the robes, lighting of the candles, using a prayer book. Read from this prayer book. Do the ceremony this way. Well, the Puritans did not want fancy art in their buildings. They did not want to wear the robes. They did not want to do the candles. You think of a New England church, the Puritans ended up being the Congregational church. It's like a white building with very, very little art in it. Did not like all the decor, did not like all of the art. Now, when they first came here, they were part of the Church of England called the Low Church, didn't do the High Church. But after a while, there was a civil war over in England. This is not the American Civil War, North versus South. There was a civil war over in England, and it was the Puritans, Oliver Cromwell, the Puritans, the Low Church, against the army and the king and the Episcopalians. So eventually there was a civil war over there. King James did not like the Puritans. Someone here, I have a quote, but he was either going to change them or get them out. Or something more, he said. So either change them or get them out or kill them all. They did have a war. Puritans kept coming, ship after ship after ship. And they are, and I was surprised when I moved here, they are the Congregational church. Every little town in Michigan has a Congregational church. I don't see them out here in the West. But every little town up there has a Congregational church. I mean, I can think of towns with 100 people in it and they have a Congregational church. So the Episcopalians were in Jamestown. The Pilgrims didn't want to be a part of anything, totally independent. The Puritans are the Congregational church. Living in that area started out Roger Williams and the Baptists. So we'll come now to number 5, Roger Williams and the Baptists. And Baptists believe in the separation of church and state, if it's defined correctly. Separation of church and state does not believe that there are no ethical laws. Everyone's, shall we say, law has to be based upon ethics. So it's not a merger of church and state to say you want to save babies. That's just ethics and laws. But separation of church and state would mean the state can't tell you what to do in your church. And separation of church and state would mean we don't want any tax money. We'll run it on our own, and we don't want you telling us what to do. Well, Roger Williams was in Massachusetts, and actually the Puritans had their own state church. You're going to do it this way. And Roger Williams said, no, I'm not going to do it this way. And being Baptist means you don't believe in baptizing babies because they're not old enough to have trusted in Jesus as Savior. So he wanted them to be old enough to place faith in Jesus as Savior before baptizing them, and he did not want to be a part of the Puritan church. So Roger Williams left. He would preach against the kings too, by the way. You know, King Charles with his mistresses, the previous King Charles, not the current one, but way back then. And he left New England and started Rhode Island. And Rhode Island from the beginning was strongly Baptist. On the other hand, it did not believe in state churches, so everybody was welcome to go there. You didn't have to be a part of any church to go there. So eventually there's all kinds of non-Christians and all kinds of different denominations and all kinds of evangelism. When the American Revolution started, Rhode Island wanted to watch to see what the Patriots were going to do. They did not want a state church. They did not want a British state church. They did not want a new colonial state church by the Americans. And when the Americans, the Yankees, said, we are going to have separation of church and state, we're not going to have a required church, then Rhode Island joined George Washington. So they were an early colonial group that just did not have state churches. Rhode Island, you know, the Puritans wanted you to be there that way, up in New England. And the Episcopalians wanted to run Virginia. But the Baptists didn't care what you were, and they didn't want the government and the church merged, and that's the way Rhode Island was. That's also the way Pennsylvania started out. Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, from William Penn. William Penn was a Quaker, and the Quakers, we think of them as being pacifists. I don't have time to talk about police and army. The soldiers did come to Jesus, and they asked him in Luke 3:18, what shall we do? And he didn't tell them to quit. He basically said, don't take anything illegally, be good soldiers. So I don't think Jesus was a pacifist, that Jesus was against the army and the police. But back to the Quakers, they were against the army and the police, and that's how Pennsylvania started. And William Penn started the colony. Oddly enough, the king owed him all kinds of money. The Penn family had all kinds of money, and the king borrowed it. And, how shall I pay you back? We don't want your money, we want land. And that's how Penn's Woods got started. So it began with the Quakers. On the other hand, those types of groups, everybody's welcome. No state church. So all kinds of different people moved to Pennsylvania. Of course, related would be the Mennonites moving into Pennsylvania, who were pacifists also. Now, to include everything, Maryland allowed Catholics. It doesn't mean everybody there was Catholic, but they allowed Catholics. And that guy's name was Lord Calvert, but he got named Lord Baltimore. Didn't live in the city of Baltimore, but named after him, he got named Lord Baltimore. So Maryland let the Catholics come, and that's how it got started. When I went to seminary in Maryland, I drove by this Lord Calvert house on the way to seminary. Still there. Now, you didn't have to be Catholic, but they were allowed. Unlike in some of these other states, they were not allowed. Now, you would not think so, but I know this from Institute for Creation and Research trying to start a Bible college. California gave them a hard time. Didn't want to let them start a Bible college. Even Texas gave them a hard time. That's where it ended up. Ended up in Dallas. But I looked again at that time. Which state had the least rules of starting a Bible college? You'll never guess it. Maryland. That's where I went to Bible college. And it's partly because it ended up it began by allowing Catholics to come. It let everybody come. It just didn't make rules. You would not think that. But I looked that up again because I went to school in Maryland. I looked it up again when the Institute of Creation Research wanted to come out of California into Texas. Both were giving them a hard time starting a Bible college. So I was curious. At that time, I looked up Maryland. And since Maryland started with freedom for Catholics, it started with freedom for everybody. Getting near the end here, I didn't know where to put the Presbyterians. They're Scottish. They didn't run any one state, but there are all kinds of them. They came all over the place, the Presbyterians, and they were here in the colonial times. And when the American Revolution broke out, the first people were the Scottish. Number one, the Presbyterians, they were the first ones. Lutherans, they came mostly later. I didn't put them in there because they came mostly later after 1776. They came after America was an independent country, and then they're coming, of course, from Germany and the Scandinavian countries. There are no Methodists in the colonial days because in the colonial days there were no Methodists. It was all Church of England. And just like all these American denominations broke away from the Church of England, the Methodists in England, they couldn't make them happy. So the Episcopalian Church kicked the Methodists out. John Wesley, founder, theologian. Charles Wesley, hymn writer. He wrote 6,000 hymns. If you get our little hymn book out and look at Charles Wesley, there's all kinds of them that we use. Methodists ended up big time in America, but there weren't any Methodists in 1776. Started after that. Threw them all out. So all these different colonies did have different people go there. And you ask, if you drive around Amarillo, there's this church, this every few blocks. Why? Because when the country got settled, people from all over the world came here. And if you don't have a state church, but let them all start their own churches, then we have all these churches, and with a little bit of work, you know what country they started from. It's still true. It's why we have so many. Will the musicians please come as we get ready for communion?